Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in the series, Dawa Ilallah, as we look at the comparative sciences at how to call people to Islam. And in the last few weeks, we've been looking at many different issues on how to call someone to Islam, how to improve ourselves, some of the skills that we can use in public speaking, how we can use one-on-one skills, how we can change ourselves to be better people, to be closer to the deen of Islam, how to be people rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah. And we've looked at some of the doctrines that Christians hold to be true, and we've been looking at some of the issues they have. Today we are going to be looking at a specific Christian denomination. Today we're going to look at one of the madhabs within Christianity. And we're going to be starting with the most well-known one that we are going to come across. Anybody want to take a guess which one it is? Roman Protestants? Jehovah Witnesses. Good man. We are going to be looking at Jehovah Witnesses, and it's going to be very factual. So it's not opinions, it's not what we think, it's what the facts are. It may be a little bit dry, meaning that it might become a bit heavy at parts. You might feel disconnected. I want you to concentrate. It's not an easy topic when we look at specifics, because we're going to look at the history, we're going to look at where they came from, who are the founders. If we do not do a proper job of looking at the background, it's very difficult to understand how they got to where they are today. So there's lots of numbers and facts and figures. The Jehovah Witnesses were started by a man by the name of Charles Russell. And Charles Russell lived in 1852. So when we think of the organization of Jehovah Witnesses, it's not that old. It's one of the more modern Christian denominations. So Charles Russell lived up until 1916. What happened in 1914? Anybody remember in history? World War. So he lived up until that time. He saw a lot of interesting things taking place. Think of the world in 1852. We're talking about cowboys in Indian time. People were riding horses, very primitive. America was relatively primitive. Wasn't big skyscrapers, wasn't big, massive, technology. The fastest thing was probably a steam engine. So this is the technology that he saw in his time. He grew up in a time where people were very confused. The value of life was very small. Nobody had much value. Science was just developing. Psychology was at its infancy. No one would have admitted that they even knew a psychologist, let alone went to one. This is the time period we're looking at. Medicine was primitive. Dentistry was almost non-existent. It was extremely primitive time to be around. Men's faith was very lopsided. People had given up on religion. It was a time of people being religious on a Sunday only. They would go to church on a Sunday because it was a custom or tradition. They didn't go because they loved God or cared about God or wanted to be closer to Him. A time where the world was looking at terrible things happening. Wars were beginning. Problems were happening. Economic issues. So it wasn't a good time if we look at the time he was born and the time that he lived in. And he formed a part of a group. There was a group of people who formed a group in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to study the text or study the Bible specifically. And during the course of his work as an investigator of Scripture, can't call him a priest or a pastor, he was an independent investigator of Scripture, Christian Scripture. He didn't like the mainstream Christianity of the day. He found there were problems with it, as we do. He found major problems in the interpretation that people had of doctrine. And he doubted the fact that there were even such a thing as an immortal soul. He didn't believe that there was an immortal soul. He believed that the immortality of a soul was in question in the text that he read. He could find very little evidence for hellfire or for hell or for an eternal punishment. He had questions about predestination or even if that existed. And he didn't believe in the bodily, fleshly return of the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, or Jesus Christ. He did not accept the Trinity. He found huge problems with that. And He believed that the world was en route to a very bad ending, the destruction of planet Earth. And so he wrote a number of papers at that time giving his doctrinal point of view. And one of the books that is ascribed to him was a publication called The Three Worlds, in which he worked and taught that how God would deal with humankind, and that mankind in the existence on planet Earth had gone through many dispensations, many different periods of time where God, according to his understanding, had tried to reconnect with civilization, had tried to reconnect with humankind. So he spoke about dispensationalism, a theology that has become quite popular in this modern day and age. But at his time, it was something different, revolutionary, something that was not accepted by the norms. This dispensationalism, that the ending of each dispensation resulted in either a death or a major change in civilization of a prophet. And so he believed that there would be a time that Jesus would come back to earth invisibly, not necessarily visibly, and that he would harvest the church, like someone would go harvesting vegetables or whatever. And that this would be the harvest of the gospel age. And so this is the type of teaching that he taught. And that in 1914, it would mark the end of the world, the end of a period of time. He said that there was a period of time for 2,520 years called the Gentile times. And that when this time had come to an end, that the world would be harvested and God would come and harvest the saints, those who were righteous. So this is what he believed, that the end of the world would take place in 1914 from his calculations. This is what he wrote in his early theology. So he was involved in a journal or magazine, if you like, in those early days in the 1870s, called the Herald of the Morning. And this was a publication similar to what we now know as the Watchtower, that is so famous throughout the world. But it was the early stages. And he was involved with other people at that time in this publication. There was no such thing as Jehovah's Witnesses at this point. And so they began to publish these different publications about the interpretations of what they read and about the imminent return, the immediate return of Jesus, either physically or spiritually or whatever. So from about 1879, the Watchtower began to develop. Maybe it wasn't known as the Watchtower at that time, but it started to develop. The books started to come out, and they started to challenge the thoughts of the day. So the movement began in those very, very early days, putting out doctrines, teachings, beliefs that they held. And many, many times over the years, they updated those doctrines and those beliefs. Many times they say, well, this is not what we believe now, we've changed this doctrine. It happened from 1879 right through until his dying days. Many times he would go through these different changes. In 1910, the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses, Russell, his organization started to bring in preachers, which they called pilgrims. And these preachers were not like pastors or priests or rabbis or imams. These were just laymen, simple people. And these pilgrims would go around and they would talk to people about the beliefs of what the magazines were giving at that time and what Russell was teaching. And they would become known as the door-to-door salesmen of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So they'd go knocking door to door, go see people. But they were originally known as pilgrims. And from that time, they would go around publicizing the doctrine of the church. And a number of people joined the denomination or joined the Jehovah's Witnesses because of their work. And this is a recipe that they followed through right to this day. It's been extremely successful. One-on-one dawah, for our sake of our understanding. And that's why I said one-on-one dawah is the most successful form of dawah. We just need to look at how successful it has been for the Jehovah's Witnesses to see that it works. And so what they did is this began their movement into mainstream communities. They went and looked for people. They didn't go look for non-Christians. They went to Christians. And because their guys, their pilgrims, were trained and made more knowledgeable about their belief system, that was easy for them to recruit people from Christianity, because the general Christian of the day, like I said in the beginning, had very, very little knowledge or even interest in what Christianity taught, which is very much the same as today. Most Christians have little, if any, knowledge of what the doctrines of the church teach. And so Russell, the founder of this Jehovah's Witness community, or these believers of those days, started something called the Watchtower Society. And its headquarters, I've been there myself when I was in Brooklyn in New York, was started there. And if you go into Brooklyn over the Brooklyn Bridge, the famous Brooklyn Bridge, it is famous throughout the world, most iconic landmark in the world, other than the Statue of Liberty. You go there, and as you cross over, there's this gigantic building, and on it says the Watchtower Society. Massive, bigger than the bridge. So their headquarters were there since 1909, still there to this day. We're going to keep talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses after we get back from this break, inshallah.
Osama El-Shami.
How can we get our children ready for the month of Ramadan?
Sharing the stories of what the Muslims have been through in the past, in particular the first generation.
Nazir Irfan Al-Mujahid.
Make this Ramadan very special to them.
Your taqwa, your righteousness, your goodness.
I want you to tell me about your experiences from the very first Ramadan that you experienced as a new Muslim.
The first Ramadan I experienced was amazing.
Umar Debua.
When I embraced Islam, it was like I was prepared. You know, Allah prepared me for something that I had no idea. It was an amazing experience. Beautiful.
My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, welcome to our program, The Straight Path.
Build your character on the path of the Quran and Sunnah in The Straight Path. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. and repeat telecast at 1 a.m. India on Peace TV. Courage it takes to stand up for what you believe in. Courage it takes to be true and righteous. Courage it takes to dare and answer your questions, be they social, political, economic, educational, or religious. To get clear and convincing answers,
Test your courage and question me in Dare to Ask.
Dare to Ask, next on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We're continuing talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses and how they were founded. It's important that we have a background knowledge of how they got to where they got to, so that when we are looking at their beliefs, when we're looking at Dawa, we have a better understanding. We don't just have, oh, you guys don't believe this and you don't believe that. It's better to have a knowledge base when talking to people. So we said that the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower Society, the headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses was in Brooklyn, New York. And in Brooklyn, New York, they founded their headquarters in 1909. And they started printing. It was their office. It was where their publications were sent. And the volunteers were housed nearby in a residence called Bethel. B-E-T-H-E-L, Bethel. And that's where the volunteers lived, very close to where the society was. And he identified this religious movement at that time as Bible students, and formerly as the International Bible Student Association. So they weren't called Jehovah's Witnesses, they weren't called witnesses or anything, they were known as Bible students. A very simple term to use. In 1910, they had about 50,000 members. So they had grown from nothing in a very, very short time to 50,000 people worldwide who were associated with the movement. And so in each group around America and those that had already gone to other places of the world, re-elected Russell each year as their pastor, as their leader. So he was elected by these 50,000 people to continue leading the church forward. Russell died on the 31st of October in 1916, 65 years old. And he had done public speaking tours all the way up to the day that he died. So he was very active as a da'i in promoting and propagating. The Jehovah's Witnesses had to obviously elect a new leader. And so they elected a man by the name of Joseph Rutherford. And Joseph Rutherford remained the leader. He continued to direct the group of the Bible students, as they were called in that day. But he had some controversial points that he brought up. And he wasn't so popular with the early fledgling church of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so we find there was a dispute that took place about him being elected. And in fact, there was a split that took place in that very early stage. And still to this day, there is a split between the Jehovah's Witnesses because of him being made president or being made pastor. And so still to this day, there are two different groups within the Jehovah's Witnesses, one lesser and one larger. His election was disputed, and the members of the board of directors accused him of acting as a dictator. And he caused this division that took place in the church. And the division between the supporters and opponents continues right through to this day. Now, once this man had got into power, he started to bring in some doctrines that became known as controversial, especially predictions of the end of the world. They made a number of predictions. None of them have happened. All of them have failed. And it basically rests on his shoulders where most of this came from. And so what we find is that a number of the criticisms at that time, because of his failed prophecies, caused a lot of people to lose and leave the church. And of course, the Protestants and the Catholics didn't like this new movement because they were succeeding where they were losing. So even with the failed prophecies and a number of the problems falling apart and within the church, it still managed to grow. And so there was a lot of criticism at that time. I'm not going to go through all the names of all the leaders. These leaders came and took over. Some of them were good leaders, some of them were bad leaders. Some of them made very, very bad predictions, some didn't. But after about the third president that they had, the third or fourth president, they started to take away the power of doctrine making, in other words, what we believe, and then try and find verses to fit it, away from their leader, and then gave it to the society, which then became known as the Watchtower. And so the Watchtower, actually the society, made decisions on doctrine, but were very, very cautious about just saying this is doctrine. So they made a doctrine about doctrine. And the doctrine that they made about doctrine was that doctrine can continuously change. Nice, convenient doctrine. It's called evolutionary doctrine. So it means that even though we say it is like this, it could change because we have a doctrine that allows us to change that doctrine. Very, very smart move by the Jehovah's Witnesses. It was because so many failed prophecies had taken place and so many errors were found that they said, yes, we're not saying we're infallible because God is revealing His doctrine to us as we are capable and able to understand it. So He's able and capable of changing the doctrine anytime when it suits Him. So this was a very, very convenient doctrine that was brought into the Jehovah's Witnesses. So we found that by the time of the 1930s, 1940s, that they had started to come up with a number of doctrines that have now moved forward through to this day. So they still have the right to claim that doctrines can change, but we find that since about the 1940s through to this present day, that most of their doctrines are more or less the same. They just have different interpretations of how to see those doctrines. So if there were 30 doctrines, those 30 doctrines are still there. They haven't replaced them. They've just altered the way you interpret them. So around about 1960s, late 1950s, 1960s, they brought out their own translation of the Bible. And their own translation of the Bible was called the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures. And this New World Translation, obviously, a lot of people have criticized it. You will hear some misinformation about their book, the New World Translation. Christians will immediately say it's full of errors, it was a terrible translation, Russell knew nothing about the Greek that he was translating it from. But there's a fatal error with the Christian logic. Can anyone guess what the fatal error with Christian logic is? They say that Russell translated the New World Translation incorrectly from the Greek. He didn't understand Greek. But when was the New World Translation printed? In 1961. He'd been dead a long time ago. So the logic of the Christian argument that we don't accept the New World Translation because, remember we said to you right in the beginning, we're not going to lie, we're going to give you what it actually says. We're not going to make up stuff. We're not going to be accused of attacking Jehovah's Witnesses for the sake of attacking Jehovah's Witnesses. We're going to give the honest truth. If I have made an error, it's my mistake. But the research that I did, I can find no evidence that you can blame Russell for the translation of the New World Translation. In fact, I personally find it a good translation. There are errors in it. Of course there are errors in it. And the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John exist in there prove there are errors in there. But it's probably one of the better of the bad translations. And so people saying, well, we don't want to read this book because the man didn't understand Greek is crazy. It's just propaganda that Christians use against the Jehovah's Witnesses. Generally, I find their translation a pretty good translation. It's better than the New International Version. It's better than the Good News, better than the Living Bible. It's better than most of the translations. Would I suggest you go out and buy it? No, don't waste your money. But the organization basically brought out their own translation. Now, obviously, it would have a lot of criticism because of their bringing out their own translation. But generally, from a serious theological, Christian theological point of view, if I had to put myself in their shoes, I find no problem with it. I don't find any serious problems. It's as bad as all the rest, and it's as good as all the rest. In fact, it's probably a bit better than most of the others. Now, the witnesses in 1966, they made a number of prophecies about what will happen to the end of the world. They said that there are a number of people that would be surviving, a number of people would die. There's 144,000 that will be selected. They were going to be the rulers over the earth, and that didn't happen, of course. The numbers started to grow because by 1975 were gigantic. They had a few 100,000 people already, so they'd passed the 144,000 mark. So they had to rewrite and rechange their doctrine. They had about, just in 1966, just so it gets an idea of statistics on how they grew, they had about 60,000 baptisms, 60,000 new members joined. We're talking about fledgling religion, so that's pretty good for a new religion. So in 1966, there were about 60,000. By 1974, so 66, there were 60,000. By 1974, they were baptizing 300,000 a year. From 60,000 to 300,000. That's a huge jump. Today, there is almost a New Kingdom Hall, Jehovah's Witness Church, being built a day worldwide. So they are very fast growing. Do not think that they are some little group nowhere. They are building more churches than KFC is building KFCs. And KFC, build everywhere, all the time. So they are more successful than the KFC franchise. They have more franchises worldwide than they do. They distribute more magazines than KFC sells burgers. So they're very successful. So their ministry continues right through to this day, and they have a governing body that controls the doctrines and the beliefs. It's not a one-man show anymore, like it had in the early days, which caused a lot of embarrassment for the church. So today, the leader of the organization is a man by the name of Don Adams. He is the leader, but he has no power. Literally, he's just like a normal president of any country, no power. He's just a figurehead. The actual power lies in Parliament. And so even though Don Adams is the head of the Jehovah's Witnesses, he's got no power. All the power is with the members of the governing body. So it's not a one-man show. People, often Christians, attack him, and they knock him down. They say this about him. He's got no power. Why are you bothering with him? Rather, let's focus on where we should be focusing, and that is looking at the doctrines written by the governing body. Leave the man alone. So baptism is required for anyone to become a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Just to say you believe in God, you have to be baptized. If you are not baptized, you cannot become a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses. This is normally done in a big public place like a soccer field, rugby field, football field. Everyone comes in witnesses, and they have the big pond there, and they baptize people there. Like a porta pool, and they get baptized there. Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. I ask that you join again and learn a little bit more about Jehovah's Witnesses and how we can do dawah to them. So from me, Areeb Islam, and all of us here, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.